Marcus Hayes woke at 0430 hours, the same time his body had risen for 16 years of SEAL operations, though now the darkness held different terrors. The nightmares had visited again, the IED blast in Syria replaying in visceral detail, the blinding flash, the pressure wave crushing his chest, the screams of teammates he couldn't save, the metallic taste of blood and desert dust. 2 operators died instantly. Marcus survived with wounds invisible to anyone who hadn't felt their mind fracture and reform into something unrecognizable. 16 months at Walter Reed had taught him that traumatic brain injury and severe PTSD weren't conditions you conquered. They were realities you managed, hour by hour, with military discipline applied to civilian survival. The medical retirement came with 100% disability rating, monthly checks, and the hollow knowledge that the Navy no longer trusted him with life or death decisions. At 39, Marcus's war was over, but the battle continued in the cramped Virginia Beach apartment where he now lived alone. His morning routine was liturgical in its precision, a bulwark against the chaos his damaged brain could unleash without structure. Wake, bathroom, medications arranged in the 7-day pill organizer the VA therapist insisted upon, sertraline for PTSD, topiramate for the migraines that followed the TBI, melatonin for sleep that rarely came peacefully. Breakfast at exactly 0600, scrambled eggs, oatmeal, black coffee, because skipping meals degraded his already compromised cognitive function. Then the checklist, printed and laminated, stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the SEAL trident he could no longer wear. Check calendar. Review client notes. Pack medical kit. Verify phone charged. Confirm appointment times. The transition to home health aid work had been the VA therapist's suggestion. You spent 16 years taking care of operators in the most dangerous places on Earth. Taking care of veterans here gives you the same purpose with lower stakes. Marcus wasn't sure about the lower stakes part. His clients depended on him just as much, just differently. But the routine kept him functional. The scheduled visits, the predictable tasks, the clear mission parameters. It was structure he could navigate even when the TBI made complex decisions feel like wading through wet concrete. His favorite client, the one who'd become more than just a name on the schedule, was Robert Bob Sullivan. 68 years old, Vietnam Marine Corps veteran, paralyzed from the waist down after a motorcycle accident 2 years prior that left him wheelchair-bound but unbowed in spirit. Bob lived in a small house in a quiet neighborhood, his modest VA disability checks and Social Security barely covering expenses but allowing him to maintain the independence he valued above everything else. That independence had a name. Duke. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was a certified service dog, trained for mobility assistance and medical alert work through a non-profit organization specializing in placing service animals with disabled veterans. Duke wasn't a pet. He was medical equipment wrapped in fur and loyalty. He retrieved items Bob dropped, helped stabilize transfers from wheelchair to bed, opened doors with adapted handles, and most critically, was trained to detect the dangerous blood pressure fluctuations common with spinal cord injuries. When Bob's blood pressure spiked or dropped precipitously, Duke would alert, nudging insistently, bringing the phone, even pressing the emergency call button mounted at wheelchair height if Bob didn't respond. Without Duke, Bob would require 24-hour assisted living care that neither his finances nor his pride could accommodate. Marcus visited Bob 3 times weekly, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 1500 hours. The routine never varied. Help with physical therapy exercises the VA physical therapist had prescribed. Prepare dinner that Bob could reheat later. Organize medications for the coming days. Handle household tasks Bob couldn't manage from the wheelchair. But more than the physical care, Marcus provided companionship. They were both warriors carrying invisible wounds, both navigating a civilian world that didn't quite understand what they'd sacrificed or what they'd become because of it. The one shadow over Bob's life was Trevor Sullivan, his 34-year-old nephew. Trevor was Bob's only living relative, his late wife's sister's son, a man who visited irregularly and always seemed to be between jobs, between girlfriends, between everything except his growing resentment at how life had treated him. Marcus had met Trevor twice, and his seal-honed threat assessment had immediately flagged warning signs. The way Trevor's eyes tracked Bob's belongings, the questions about VA benefits and property values, the barely concealed frustration when Bob mentioned his plans to leave the house to a veterans charity rather than family. Over recent months, Bob had grown visibly anxious whenever Trevor's visits approached. He'd check the locks repeatedly, ask Marcus to stay longer, make excuses about why Trevor couldn't have the spare house key he kept requesting. Duke's behavior around Trevor was telling. The normally calm service dog would position himself between Bob and his nephew, hackles raised slightly, a low rumble in his chest that spoke to threats the dog sensed, but Bob wouldn't acknowledge. This particular Thursday, November 20th, 25, Marcus felt the wrongness before he even parked his aging Honda Civic in front of Bob's house. The heavy front door, installed with Bob's VA home modification grant, designed for wheelchair accessibility and security, stood wide open. Bob's paranoid, careful routine, born from years of military discipline and reinforced by vulnerability, meant the door was always locked, always closed. The November wind pulled dead leaves across the threshold into the house. Marcus's TBI made sudden, unexpected situations difficult to process. The cognitive fog would descend, decision-making pathways would stutter, but years of SEAL training provided automatic responses that bypassed conscious thought. His hand moved to his phone, thumb hovering over the 911 quick dial, while his body moved toward the door with careful, tactical precision. Inside, voices, Bob's, strained and frightened, and another male voice Marcus recognized as Trevor's, though he'd never heard it with this raw, dangerous edge. The living room scene assembled itself in Marcus's vision like a tactical assessment brief. Bob in his wheelchair, nose bleeding freely down his Marine Corps t-shirt, left eye swelling shut. Trevor standing over him, swaying slightly, clutching a bottle of Jim Beam in one hand and crumpled papers in the other. Duke positioned between them, favoring his right front leg, blood matting the fur around his muzzle, growling with an intensity Marcus had never witnessed from the normally gentle service dog. The papers Trevor waved were legal documents. Marcus could see power of attorney in bold letters across the top. The bottle was 2/3 empty. Trevor's face was flushed with alcohol and rage, spittle flying as he shouted, "Sign the damn papers, old man. You're crippled. You can't manage this house. I'm family. I should be handling your finances. That stupid dog can't protect you from reality. You're going into a home whether you like it or not." Bob's voice trembled but held firm. "Trevor, you're drunk. You hit me. You hurt Duke. I want you to leave. We can discuss this with my attorney when you're sober." Trevor's rage amplified. "Attorney? This animal!" He kicked toward Duke, who dodged despite his injured leg, the movement clearly painful. "This dog is the problem. If you didn't have this animal, you'd already be in assisted living. The VA shouldn't be paying for a dog when they could be paying me to take care of you." Trevor raised his foot again, this time clearly intending to stomp on Duke's injured leg, to eliminate the obstacle between him and Bob's assets through violence and intimidation. That's when Marcus intervened, his PTSD screaming warnings that made his vision tunnel and his hands shake, but his SEAL training providing structure, his damaged brain could follow. In the 2 seconds before Trevor's foot connected with an injured service dog protecting his disabled handler, Marcus was between them, intercepting Trevor's advance with controlled presence, despite the enormous psychological cost of confrontation. "Stop," Marcus said, his voice showing strain from PTSD management, but carrying the authority of 16 years commanding operators in hostile environments. "You assaulted a disabled 68-year-old Marine Corps veteran. You struck his certified service dog hard enough to cause injury. You're attempting to coerce him into signing legal documents while intoxicated and using violence. That's elder abuse under Virginia Code, animal cruelty under federal law for assaulting service animals, and financial exploitation. I'm a witness. This ends now." Trevor spun toward Marcus, alcohol-impaired judgment, seeing another obstacle between him and what he wanted. "Who are you? Another VA leech? Get out! This is family business. My uncle needs professional care, not some part-time aide and a stupid dog." Marcus maintained position between Trevor and both Bob and Duke, his hands shaking slightly from PTSD symptoms he was barely controlling, but his tactical positioning solid. "I'm Bob's home health aide. I have legal authorization to be here provided by the VA. You don't? Bob asked you to leave. You're intoxicated. You assaulted a disabled veteran, causing visible injury. You injured a certified service dog trained for medical alert work, and you're attempting financial coercion using threats and violence. Those are federal offenses involving veterans and service animals under Title 18 U.S.C. Section 1389. Leave immediately, or I document this for law enforcement and adult protective services." Trevor made a critical tactical error. He shoved Marcus, attempting to push past him toward Bob. "I said get out. That old man is signing those papers today. The dog goes to the pound, and you're fired." Marcus didn't respond with force. His PTSD made violence unpredictable and potentially uncontrollable, so his training emphasized controlled de-escalation as the primary response. He absorbed Trevor's shove, using the momentum and leverage to guide Trevor away from Bob and Duke rather than engaging in direct combat, and maintained protective positioning while calling 911 on his cell phone, despite hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped it. "This is Marcus Hayes at 2156 Elm Street, Virginia Beach. I'm a home health aide and disabled veteran. I'm witnessing elder abuse of a disabled Marine Corps veteran by his nephew. Suspect is intoxicated, has assaulted the victim, causing visible injuries. injured the victim's certified service dog, and is attempting financial coercion using violence and threats. I've restrained the suspect without injury using minimal force. Please send police, adult protective services, and animal control. Specify this involves a disabled veteran and assault on a federally protected service dog. Trevor continued threatening while Marcus maintained control. You're done. I'll sue you. I'll have your license revoked. My uncle is incompetent. He can't live here with just a dog. Those papers are for his own good. You're going to regret this. Marcus's response, delivered through PTSD symptoms he was barely controlling. His voice shaking, but his legal knowledge precise. Bob Sullivan is a competent adult veteran with documented capacity, regular medical care, and legal care arrangements approved by the VA. Duke is a certified service dog trained specifically for mobility assistance and medical alert work under ADA provisions and Virginia Service Animal Statutes. You arrived intoxicated, assaulted Bob, causing visible injury requiring medical attention, struck Duke, causing injury to a working service animal. That's a federal offense under 18 U.S.C. 1389 for assaulting service animals. You're attempting to coerce legal documents under duress using violence. That's financial elder abuse under Virginia Code 18.2, 178.1. Bob's home security camera system recorded everything. Police are 3 minutes out. Your intoxication, violence, and attempted exploitation are all documented with timestamps and video evidence. Virginia Beach Police arrived within 6 minutes. Patrol units followed by animal control for the injured service dog and adult protective services for the elder abuse investigation. Marcus provided his statement using SEAL precision despite the PTSD making the stress nearly overwhelming. His hands shook continuously. He had to pause multiple times to manage anxiety attacks. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the November chill, but the training held. Timeline with specific timestamps. Legal violations with exact statute citations. Witness account with tactical detail. Security camera footage locations and access codes. Bob confirmed Trevor's assault, the repeated coercion attempts over months, the escalating threats, and the injury to Duke, who'd only been protecting his handler as trained. Duke received immediate veterinary assessment from animal control, bruised ribs consistent with being kicked, sprained front leg, lacerations on the muzzle from being struck, but fundamentally functional and expected to heal with treatment and rest. Trevor was arrested on multiple charges: elder abuse under Virginia Code 18.2369, assault and battery under Virginia Code 18.257, animal cruelty with the enhanced federal charge under 18 U.S.C. 1389 for assaulting a service animal, and attempted financial exploitation of an incapacitated adult under Virginia Code 18.2, 178.1. Adult Protective Services documented Bob's competence through on-site assessment and noted Duke's critical role in Bob's independence and medical safety. The immediate crisis seemed resolved. Trevor was in custody, Bob was safe, Duke was receiving veterinary care, and the system appeared to be working as designed. Marcus allowed himself to believe maybe this was over. Maybe he'd actually helped successfully. Maybe his damaged brain and broken psyche could still serve some useful purpose. But within 72 hours, the counterattack began. Trevor had been released on bail, posted by someone. Marcus never learned who. and his attorney, an aggressive family law specialist named Gerald Whitmore, who specialized in contested conservatorship cases, launched a comprehensive legal strategy designed to strip Bob of autonomy and control. Emergency conservatorship petition filed with Virginia Beach Circuit Court, claiming Bob was incompetent to manage his own affairs and living in an unsafe environment. The petition argued that Bob's paralysis, his dependence on a large, aggressive dog, and his reliance on a part-time aide with severe PTSD and traumatic brain injury demonstrated he couldn't make sound decisions about his own care and safety. Petition to remove Duke from the home, claiming the service dog was dangerous based on his protective behavior during Trevor's assault. The petition cited Duke's growling, positioning between Trevor and Bob, and aggressive posture as evidence of a dangerous animal that posed risks to visitors and caregivers. Criminal complaint against Marcus, claiming excessive force and assault by a disabled veteran with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. The complaint alleged Marcus had violently attacked Trevor without provocation, that his mental health conditions made him prone to violence and unstable, and that his testimony was unreliable due to cognitive impairment. Family petition claiming Trevor was Bob's only concerned relative, acting in his uncle's best interests, that Bob's isolation from family was evidence of undue influence by caregivers, and that institutional care was the only safe option for someone with Bob's level of disability. Bob's VA-appointed attorney, Linda Ramirez, contacted Marcus with grave concerns. Trevor is using his family relationship and Bob's disability to pressure conservatorship through the courts. The petition explicitly claims Bob's dependence on Duke proves incompetence to live independently. They're arguing that relying on a dog rather than human care demonstrates inability to make sound decisions about safety and well-being. If successful, Trevor gains complete control of Bob's finances, medical decisions, and living arrangements. Bob loses his home, his independence, and likely Duke. Most assisted living facilities don't accommodate large service dogs, especially those labeled aggressive in court filings. Marcus, your PTSD and TBI are being weaponized. Trevor's attorney argues your documented mental health conditions make you an unreliable witness, and that your intervention was excessive force by someone with combat-related mental illness prone to violence. Marcus's first instinct was complete withdrawal. Confrontation triggered his PTSD severely. Courtroom complexity overwhelmed his TBI-compromised cognitive processing, and he was terrified his disability would invalidate everything he'd witnessed and documented. The anxiety attacks increased in frequency and severity. Sleep became nearly impossible. The intrusive memories of the Syria IED blast mixed with new flashbacks of Trevor's violence. His hands shook so badly he could barely write notes. The VA crisis line talked him through two separate panic attacks in 3 days. But the situation represented everything the VA therapist had taught him about recovery: service to fellow veterans, purpose through helping others, using his experience to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Bob was a Marine who'd served in Vietnam and survived paralysis. He deserved better than being stripped of autonomy by a nephew who saw dollar signs instead of a human being. Duke was a trained service dog doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He deserved legal protection, not euthanasia for protecting his handler. Marcus made a decision, despite his disabilities, making it exponentially harder. He was organizing Bob's defense, using whatever operational capacity his damaged brain retained. With intensive help from his VA therapist to manage the stress and cognitive demands, Marcus spent 2 weeks compiling comprehensive documentation, daily living logs showing Bob's independence in managing medications, hygiene, meals, and household decisions. Medical records from Bob's primary care physician and neurologist documenting normal cognitive function and capacity for independent decision-making. Cognitive assessments using standardized instruments showing Bob scored within normal ranges for his age and education level. Financial records showing Bob successfully managed his own accounts, paid bills on time, and made appropriate financial decisions. Duke's service dog certification, training records, and medical necessity documentation from the placing organization. Video footage from Bob's security system showing Trevor's assault in complete detail. Witness statements from neighbors, other caregivers, and Bob's medical providers. Marcus's own detailed testimony with supporting documentation of his qualifications, training, and the specific incident. The conservatorship hearing became the critical engagement, scheduled for December 3rd, 2025, in Virginia Beach Circuit Court. Trevor's attorney, Gerald Whitmore, argued forcefully. Robert Sullivan is a paralyzed 68-year-old man living alone in a house dependent on a large dog and a part-time disabled veteran aide with documented PTSD and traumatic brain injury who works limited hours. This living arrangement is objectively unsafe for someone with Mr. Sullivan's level of disability. He needs 24-hour professional care in a licensed facility where trained staff can ensure his safety and well-being. His nephew, Trevor Sullivan, despite the regrettable incident that occurred when emotions ran high, remains his only living family member genuinely concerned about ensuring proper professional care rather than allowing continued isolation in an unsafe environment. Bob's attorney, Linda Ramirez, countered systematically with Marcus's meticulous documentation. Robert Sullivan is a competent adult successfully managing his disability with appropriate support systems exactly as disability law and VA policy intend. His service dog Duke provides critical mobility assistance and medical alert functions that are protected under ADA provisions and Virginia Service Animal Statutes. His aide, Marcus Hayes, is a disabled Navy SEAL veteran providing excellent professional care. Research shows 20 to 30% of post-9/11 veterans have PTSD, and Mr. Hayes' disabilities don't diminish his capabilities as a caregiver or witness. Both Bob's service dog and his aide represent exactly the support disabled veterans need and deserve to maintain independence. The only actual threat to Bob's safety was his nephew's drunken assault and exploitation attempt, which Mr. Hayes appropriately intervened to stop. Marcus testified, despite visible PTSD symptoms, his hands shook continuously, requiring him to grip the witness stand to steady himself. He paused frequently to manage anxiety and maintain cognitive focus. He used detailed notes because TBI affected his short-term memory and recall under stress, but his account was clear, precise, methodical, and completely corroborated by security footage showing Trevor's assault on both Bob and Duke in graphic detail. Bob's primary care physician testified that Bob was mentally competent with normal cognitive function for his age, physically capable of living independently with appropriate mobility assistance and part-time caregiver support, and that removing him from his home environment would likely cause severe depression and health decline. Bob's neurologist provided expert testimony that despite the paralysis from his spinal cord injury, Bob's cognitive function was completely normal. He demonstrated excellent judgment in managing his medical care and living arrangements, and there was absolutely no medical basis for claims of incompetence. Duke's service dog trainer from the placing organization testified in compelling detail. Duke is specifically trained for mobility assistance work and medical alert functions. When Bob's blood pressure drops or spikes, which is common with spinal injuries and can be life-threatening, Duke alerts by nudging, vocalizing, and if Bob doesn't respond, pressing the emergency call button we installed at wheelchair height. Duke's protective behavior during Trevor Sullivan's assault was exactly what we trained for. Appropriate response to his handler being physically attacked. Research shows 79% of service dog handlers experience interference with their dogs from poorly trained animals, aggressive people, or those who don't respect service animal protections. Duke protected Bob exactly as trained, and labeling that as dangerous behavior fundamentally misunderstands service dog work. The judge, after reviewing all evidence, witness testimony, and legal arguments, issued a definitive ruling. Conservatorship petition denied. Mr. Robert Sullivan is clearly competent based on extensive medical testimony and documented evidence, appropriately supported by professional healthcare assistance and a certified service dog, and absolutely entitled to live independently as protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, Virginia Disability Rights Statutes, and basic human dignity. His service dog, Duke, is essential to his medical safety and mobility under federal disability law and cannot be removed based on appropriate protective behavior during an assault. His aide, Mr. Marcus Hayes, despite his own service-related disabilities, provided appropriate professional care and intervention using minimal necessary force to protect a vulnerable adult from ongoing assault. Research demonstrates that service dogs significantly reduce PTSD symptoms and improve quality of life for disabled veterans. Mr. Sullivan's support system represents best practices in veteran care. Trevor Sullivan's petition appears motivated primarily by financial interest in his uncle's assets rather than genuine concern for his uncle's welfare and safety. Petition dismissed with prejudice. Permanent protective order issued preventing Trevor Sullivan from any contact with Robert Sullivan without court supervision and approval. Trevor Sullivan faced comprehensive criminal prosecution for his assault and attempted exploitation. The Commonwealth's attorney for Virginia Beach pursued all charges aggressively, and Trevor was ultimately convicted on every count. Elder abuse under Virginia Code 18.2 to 369, assault and battery under Virginia Code 18.257, animal cruelty with the enhanced federal charge. Under 18 U.S.C. 1389, for assaulting a service animal, which carried federal penalties significantly more severe than state animal cruelty charges, and attempted financial exploitation of an incapacitated adult under Virginia Code 18.2, 178.1. The sentencing hearing included victim impact statements from both Bob and Marcus. Bob, speaking from his wheelchair with Duke at his side, described months of escalating threats, the terror of being assaulted in his own home by someone who was supposed to be family. and the violation of having his autonomy questioned because he relied on adaptive equipment that happened to have fur and loyalty. Marcus, hands still shaking but voice steady, described witnessing elder abuse and making the choice to intervene despite knowing it would trigger severe PTSD symptoms that took weeks to manage afterward. The judge sentenced Trevor to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, mandatory substance abuse treatment for his alcohol problem, mandatory anger management counseling, restitution for Bob's medical expenses and Duke's veterinary care, and a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with Bob Sullivan under any circumstances. The judge's statement was unequivocal. "Mr. Sullivan, you assaulted a disabled veteran who served this country with honor. You injured a service animal performing medical functions protected by federal law, and you attempted to exploit your uncle's disability for financial gain. Your actions represent a profound betrayal of family obligations and basic human decency. This court will not tolerate elder abuse or exploitation of disabled veterans." Bob maintained his hard-won independence, continuing to live successfully in his home with Duke's essential assistance and Marcus's professional healthcare support 3 times weekly. Adult Protective Services conducted regular follow-up monitoring visits every month for the first 6 months, then quarterly thereafter, consistently documenting in their reports that Bob's living arrangement was safe, appropriate, medically sound, and superior to institutional care for his specific needs and circumstances. The relationship between Bob and Marcus evolved beyond professional caregiver and client into genuine friendship forged through shared combat. Bob's in Vietnam jungles, Marcus's in Middle Eastern deserts, and in the daily battles against PTSD and TBI. They understood each other's invisible wounds in ways civilians couldn't, the way both men startled at sudden loud noises, or the nightmares neither discussed, but both recognized in each other's tired eyes, the fierce determination to maintain control and autonomy when so much had already been taken by violence and disability. Marcus discovered through his advocacy work with Bob that their situation reflected much broader challenges facing disabled veterans nationwide. Thousands of disabled veterans struggled to maintain independence when family members or institutions questioned their capacity to live independently, despite research demonstrating that service dogs significantly improved veteran outcomes. Studies showed service dogs reduced PTSD symptoms by clinically meaningful margins, decreased suicide ideation, improved medication adherence, enhanced social functioning, and enabled independent living that would otherwise require expensive institutional care. Yet disabled veterans with service dogs routinely faced interference, harassment, and legal challenges from family members seeking conservatorship, landlords refusing accommodation, businesses denying access, and systems that prioritized institutional care over community-based independence. The research validated what Marcus and Bob lived daily. That with appropriate support, including service dogs, part-time professional care, and adaptive equipment, disabled veterans could live independently with dignity and autonomy. Marcus began volunteering with veteran service dog organizations throughout Virginia, despite his own disabilities making the work challenging. He helped other disabled veterans document their competence through detailed daily living logs, coordinated with medical providers for capacity assessments, navigated complex legal systems, and provided peer support from someone who understood both invisible wounds and the fight to protect independence. His PTSD and TBI meant he worked limited hours, needed frequent breaks to manage symptoms, required detailed written protocols to compensate for cognitive challenges, and sometimes had to cancel commitments when symptoms overwhelmed his capacity. But the work gave him renewed purpose, helping other disabled veterans fight the same battles he and Bob had fought, using his SEAL operational planning skills for civilian advocacy instead of combat operations. 1 year after the incident that changed both their lives, Marcus spoke at a Department of Veterans Affairs conference on veteran service dogs and independent living, sharing the stage with Bob and Duke. The conference attracted hundreds of attendees, including disabled veterans, service dog organizations, VA medical providers, disability rights advocates, and policymakers considering legislation to strengthen protections for veterans with service animals. Asked by a VA social worker how he'd found the courage to intervene despite his PTSD and TBI making confrontation dangerous for his own mental health, Marcus's answer became foundational text for disabled veteran advocacy programs nationwide. Research shows 20 to 30% of post-9/11 veterans have PTSD, and service dogs reduce PTSD symptoms significantly. One major study showed veterans with service dogs had a 3.7-point greater reduction in PTSD severity compared to those with emotional support animals. Bob is a Vietnam Marine who earned his independence through service to this country and surviving paralysis that would have destroyed most people's will to continue. Duke is a trained service dog, making that independence possible under federal disability law and representing best practices in veteran rehabilitation. Trevor was committing elder abuse disguised as family concern, using Bob's disability as a weapon to strip his autonomy for financial gain. Intervening cost me personally. My PTSD symptoms spiked severely for weeks afterward. The legal complexity overwhelmed my TBI-compromised cognitive processing, and there were days I wasn't sure I'd made the right decision. But research shows nearly 18 service members and veterans die by suicide daily in this country. Bob didn't survive Vietnam combat, and devastating paralysis just to lose his independence and his service dog to a nephew who saw dollar signs instead of a human being deserving dignity. Sometimes the most important operations aren't overseas in combat zones. They're in living rooms where disabled veterans need other disabled veterans who remember that service dogs exist to preserve independence. That disability doesn't equal incompetence, and that protecting each other is what veterans do even when our own disabilities make it incredibly hard. The presentation included Duke demonstrating his trained tasks, retrieving dropped items, helping Bob with wheelchair transfers, pressing the emergency call button on command, proving to skeptical attendees exactly how service dogs enabled independence for disabled veterans. The Virginia Beach case became a template for disability rights advocates nationwide, cited in legal briefs, policy recommendations, and training materials for adult protective services workers learning to distinguish between appropriate concern and exploitation disguised as family care. 2 years after that, Thursday afternoon, confrontation Marcus received recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs for advocacy work that had helped protect the rights of hundreds of disabled veterans facing similar challenges, family members seeking conservatorship based on service dog dependence, institutions questioning capacity based on disability, systems prioritizing convenience over independence. His volunteer work had contributed to policy changes, strengthening VA support for community-based independent living and service dog partnerships. During the recognition ceremony at the VA Medical Center in Hampton, Virginia, Marcus was asked about the lasting impact of transitioning from SEAL combat operations to civilian caregiving and advocacy. His answer captured the complete arc of his journey from the Syria IED blast through medical retirement to finding renewed purpose. I left the SEALs because PTSD and TBI made me a liability in combat operations. The blast that killed 2 teammates also killed the version of myself I'd known for 16 years. The operator who could make split-second decisions under fire, who could trust his memory and cognition, who didn't wake up every night reliving violence. Civilian life felt like punishment, like I'd been cast out from the only family and purpose I'd known. Working as a home health aide seemed like penance for surviving when better men died. But Bob's situation taught me that protecting vulnerable people doesn't end with combat retirement. It just changes form and requires different applications of the same courage. Research shows veterans with service dogs have significantly lower PTSD symptoms, 66% lower odds of PTSD diagnosis after 3 months, improved social functioning, and better medication adherence. Service dogs don't just help disabled veterans, they save lives and preserve dignity that violence and disability threaten to destroy. Trevor represented the kind of exploitation and abuse I'd fought against overseas, just wearing a different face and using family relationships instead of weapons. Intervening meant confronting every limitation my disabilities imposed, accepting help from therapists and attorneys, documenting obsessively to compensate for memory problems, and trusting that my broken brain and damaged psyche could still serve some useful purpose. The most important lesson wasn't about defeating Trevor in court. It was learning that warriors don't stop being warriors when they become disabled. We just find new missions that require the same discipline, the same refusal to abandon vulnerable people, and the same understanding that sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones we fight with weapons, but the ones we fight with patience, documentation, and the stubborn insistence that disability doesn't disqualify anyone from living with dignity, autonomy, and the service dogs that make independence possible when everything else has been taken by violence and time. The nephew who assaulted his disabled uncle and attacked his K-9 service dog learned that arriving at a scene where a Navy SEAL had positioned himself as protector, even a disabled SEAL struggling with PTSD and TBI, meant facing not just physical intervention, but comprehensive operational defense, mobilizing legal systems, medical expertise, community support, and the unbreakable bond between veterans who understand that protecting each other transcends rank, branch, generation, or the disabilities combat and time inflict. The case proved that disabled veterans supporting disabled veterans with service dogs represented outcomes research already validated. That 79% of service dog handlers face interference requiring advocacy. that service dogs reduce PTSD symptoms and prevent veteran suicides, and that warriors who become disabled defending their country deserve other warriors willing to defend their right to live with dignity, autonomy, and the service dogs that make independence possible, even when those defending warriors carry their own disabilities into battles that matter more than any they fought overseas, because these battles determine whether surviving combat means actually living or merely existing in systems that prioritize convenience and cost over the independence veterans earned through service and sacrifice.